I was standing in the center aisle of the church when I realized I was being asked to disappear. Sunlight poured through stained glass, dust floating in the air, the organ humming softly as if nothing was wrong. My hands were steady, but my chest felt hollow, like the floor had quietly dropped away beneath me. If you're watching this and you've ever been pushed aside in a moment that was supposed to matter, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this don't stay silent for long. The pews were full. The water waited at the altar, and I could hear a baby stirring somewhere behind me. I had come as a grandmother, proud and certain of my place, and in a single breath that certainty vanished. I walked out calmly, past familiar faces, carrying something no one else could see. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything started to unravel. I was asked to leave my grandson's baptism while the church was still full and the organ was warming the room. One moment I was standing there as a proud grandmother. The next I was being quietly erased in front of family, neighbors, and God himself. The sanctuary smelled of old wood and lilies, sunlight cutting through stained glass onto polished pews. I had dressed carefully that morning, hands shaking just a little as I buttoned my coat, thinking only about the weight of my grandson in my arms and the promise of his life ahead. Instead, I felt that promise pull away from me in a single breath. I remember how still everything felt. My face stayed calm, my spine straight, even as something inside me cracked. I had raised my son in that town, prayed in that church, believed in the idea that family meant belonging. I walked down the aisle alone, each step heavy but measured. As the doors closed behind me, I understood something clearly for the first time. I left quietly, knowing this was unfinished. I need to go back to who I thought we were before that morning. In my mind, we were a careful, loving family that believed in showing up quietly for each other. My son, Andrew, had always been steady, not loud with affection, but loyal, dependable. The kind of man who paid his bills early and called on Sundays. When he married Lauren, I wanted to be the kind of mother-in-law who never crossed lines. I told myself my job was to support, not interfere, to love without hovering. When their baby was born, that instinct doubled. I watched my words, my visits, even my expressions. I brought meals and left early. I asked before holding the baby. I told myself this was what respect looked like. There were moments, small enough to dismiss, a look that lingered too long, a pause before answering simple questions, invitations that stopped coming without explanation. I felt it in my chest before I ever named it, a tightening that said something was shifting, but I pushed that feeling down. I reminded myself that young families are fragile, that harmony matters more than comfort. I chose patience over honesty and silence over questions. At the time, it felt like love. Looking back, I see how those quiet choices stacked up, one after another, until the distance between us felt normal. I did not know then that these small compromises would become habits, and habits would slowly carve away trust, day by day, without any single moment dramatic enough to stop it from forming quietly. I did not lose my place all at once. It happened in pieces, small enough to doubt and easy to excuse. Phone calls that used to come weekly stretched into silence. Plans were made without mentioning them to me until they were already past. When I visited, I stayed shorter, spoke softer, cleaned more than I should have, as if effort could earn permission. I told myself this was normal, that families change shape. I adjusted constantly. I asked before stopping by, then stopped asking at all. I offered help and learned to withdraw it gracefully. I reread messages before sending them, looking for anything that might sound wrong. When something felt off, I blamed my own sensitivity and reminded myself not to create problems where none were spoken aloud. The hardest part was how quiet it all was. No arguments, no clear rejection, just a steady narrowing of space. I felt myself shrinking to fit whatever version of me felt least disruptive. By the time I noticed the exhaustion, it had already settled into my bones. Still, I kept hoping. I believed that showing patience would be rewarded, that consistency would eventually soften whatever distance had formed. I told myself, love was endurance, not insistence. When the baptism invitation arrived, it felt like a turning point, a public moment, a chance to stand together again, to be seen not as a complication but as family. I prepared for it with care and optimism, convinced that this ceremony might quietly stitch something back together. I did not know then how fragile that hope really was. I carried that belief with me into the church, holding it carefully, unaware that the final cut would come not from silence, but from being asked to step aside in front of everyone I loved. I was standing near the front pew when I felt the shift. Not a sound, not a scene, just the unmistakable understanding that I was no longer welcome where I stood. The church was full of soft music and whispered joy. Babies cried, candles flickered, and sunlight rested gently on the altar. This was supposed to be a moment of blessing, of family gathered under something sacred. Instead, my body went cold. I looked at my son and saw hesitation where there should have been certainty. In that pause, I understood the choice he was making. Peace would be kept, just not with me. I did not feel anger first. I felt small, as if the space around me had quietly tightened. My hands felt heavy at my sides. My ears rang, not loudly, just enough to blur the edges of everything else. I realized I was holding my breath. Years of restraint settled into a single, weighty second. I told myself to stay composed, to move slowly, to give no one the satisfaction of seeing me fracture. I straightened my shoulders and stepped away from the pew, careful not to rush. As I walked down the aisle alone, I felt something detach inside me. Love did not disappear, but trust loosened its grip. When the church doors closed behind me, the ceremony continued without interruption. I stood outside in the quiet air, strangely calm. The shock had passed. What remained was clarity. Whatever came next would no longer be shaped by hope, but by truth. I sensed the story turning, and I accepted that leaving was the beginning, not the ending, of what I needed to do next quietly. I did not leave that church confused or defeated. I left because I already understood more than anyone realized. For a long time, I had been treated as background noise, too polite to confront, too quiet to question. That dismissal gave me something unexpected: invisibility. People stop guarding themselves when they think you are harmless. I noticed patterns long before the baptism, dates that changed without explanation, stories that shifted slightly depending on who was listening, decisions presented as sudden that had clearly been rehearsed. None of it was dramatic on its own, but together it formed a shape I could not ignore. I learned to watch without reacting, to listen without correcting. I trusted my instincts and wrote things down privately, not to build a case, but to understand the truth of my own experience. Every small inconsistency confirmed that my unease had not come from imagination. Being underestimated is strangely freeing. No one expects you to remember details or connect dots. No one notices when you step back and observe. While I was being managed and minimized, I was also preparing myself for clarity. So when I walked out of that church, it was not an emotional retreat. It was a decision. I already knew there was something deeper beneath the surface, something that explained the distance, the control, the quiet exclusions. They saw a humiliated grandmother leaving a sacred moment. What they did not see was a woman who had already pieced together enough to know this story was about to change, and that the truth, once named, would not be easy for anyone to dismiss. I carried that knowledge quietly, certain that understanding would matter more than confrontation when the moment arrived and the surface finally cracked and forced everything hidden into the open at last. I spent weeks hoping I was wrong. I checked details quietly, telling myself there had to be a harmless explanation, a misunderstanding shaped by distance and hurt feelings. Instead of guessing, I verified. Birth records did not match timelines I had been given. Names shifted depending on paperwork. Addresses led to people who had never met my son. Each discovery came slowly, like ice cracking under careful steps. I kept waiting for something to cancel it out. One clear fact that would let me stop looking, but the pieces aligned too cleanly. The child I believed was my biological grandson was not biologically related to my son at all. Realizing that felt like the air leaving the room. My first instinct was grief, not anger. I mourned the truth I thought I knew, the family story I had defended so carefully. I also felt fear, because deception at that scale is never just personal. It carries legal weight, consequences that extend far beyond feelings. What unsettled me most was how intentional it all appeared. This was not confusion, it was construction. Documents arranged, histories adjusted, silence enforced, and my son, whether knowingly or not, had been placed inside that structure. I sat with that knowledge alone. I thought about the child, innocent in all of it. I thought about what happens when lies are allowed to harden into foundations. I did not want to be the one to break everything open, but I understood something deeply then. Knowing the truth changes responsibility. Once I was certain, staying silent was no longer an act of love, it was complicity. And that meant there was only one thing left to do. Even if it cost me the last illusion of peace I had been holding on to, I knew the next step would change every relationship, and once taken, there would be no returning to the comfort of not knowing at all. I sat in my car with the engine off, the church doors still visible in my rearview mirror. The quiet felt heavy, like the pause before something irreversible. I held my phone without unlocking it. I knew exactly who I needed to call, and I knew that once I did, there would be no careful way back to how things were. Fear showed up first, not for myself, but for everyone who would be forced to face the truth. I thought about the child, about growing up inside a story that was not fully theirs. I thought about the man whose name appeared in records but had never been spoken aloud. Silence suddenly felt less like protection and more like harm. I reminded myself that truth does not belong to whoever is most comfortable. It belongs to the people most affected by it. Keeping it hidden would only extend the damage, not soften it. So I made the decision quietly, not in anger, not to punish anyone. I chose responsibility over peace, knowing those are rarely the same thing. I understood that once the call was made, outcomes would move faster than feelings. When I finally pressed the screen and listened to the ring, I felt steady, sad, but certain. Whatever followed would be bigger than me, shaped by law, biology, and consequences I could not manage or contain. As I ended the call, I sat back and breathed. The old version of my family life was gone. In its place was motion, truth, and a chain of events ahead. I thought there would be time after the call, time to breathe, to prepare, to explain myself. There wasn't. Within hours, the situation no longer belonged to me. Systems moved in directions I couldn't slow down. Questions were asked that I wasn't meant to answer, and information traveled faster than emotion ever could. I felt strangely detached, like I was watching my own life from across the room. My phone buzzed and went quiet again. Messages stacked up unread. The truth was no longer something whispered between records and instincts. It had weight now, and momentum. There was no satisfaction in being right, only a dull confirmation that my fear had been justified. The validation didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing in the middle of a storm you warned everyone about, knowing the warning doesn't stop the damage. Time blurred. Morning slipped into afternoon without markers. My body moved on autopilot while my mind stayed fixed on what couldn't be undone. I understood then that consequences are not neat or contained. They spread outward, touching people who never agreed to be part of the truth. I said very little. Silence became the only thing I could still control. I turned my phone face down and waited, knowing the next voice I would have to face was my son's, and that whatever came next would not be gentle. I braced myself for that moment, aware that love and truth were about to collide without protection or sense of mercy. I saw my son again after everything unraveled, and he looked smaller than I remembered. His shoulders curved inward, his eyes unfocused, like someone trying to wake up inside a nightmare he didn't choose. I watched him struggle to put the pieces together. Confusion came first, then shame, then a grief so heavy it seemed to pull the air from the room. I felt my own hurt rise instinctively, sharp and immediate, but it softened when I recognized that he had been standing on the same false ground I had. He was not defending lies anymore. He was mourning them. That mattered to me. The mother in me wanted to gather him up, to shield him from consequences I knew would keep coming regardless of love. Another part of me wanted to scream about the humiliation, the silence, the years of being pushed aside. Both feelings existed at once, and neither canceled the other out. I did not excuse what happened, but I also refused to turn my pain into a weapon. We sat in the truth together, stripped of certainty, stripped of the future we thought we understood. In that moment, anger gave way to something quieter and heavier. We had both lost something irreplaceable, and neither of us knew how to grieve it yet. As I looked at him, my thoughts drifted to the child at the center of everything. Loving that child had been real, regardless of biology or paperwork. And now I understood that the hardest part ahead would not be facing my son, but learning how to say goodbye. It felt necessary, unbearable, and permanent. I grieved the child quietly, in ordinary moments that felt suddenly hollow. The small shoes by the door, the half-finished puzzles, the habit of listening for a laugh that no longer came. Loving that child had been simple. It lived in bedtime routines, sticky hands reaching for mine, the weight of trust placed without question. None of that disappeared when the truth surfaced. Love doesn't ask permission from biology. I reminded myself that love is not possession. Caring deeply does not grant the right to stay. The child deserved a future built on honesty, not comfort borrowed from confusion. Accepting that truth hurt more than anger ever could. I let myself cry without accusation, not because something was stolen, but because something precious had been real. Grief, I learned, is not proof of wrongdoing. It is proof of connection. There was dignity in stepping back, in blessing a path I would no longer walk beside. I held on to the hope that the love I gave had added something gentle and lasting, even if I would never witness its growth. With time, the sharpness softened into a quiet ache. I carried it with respect, not resistance. Letting go did not erase the bond. It simply changed how I held it, allowing stillness to replace longing and space to open where healing could begin. I trusted that distance, handled gently, would teach me patience, compassion, and a slower, kinder way forward alone. Weeks passed without ceremony. I woke up, made coffee, folded laundry, and learned how to exist inside quieter days. At first, everything felt flat, not unbearable, just muted. Grief didn't leave. It changed texture. Some mornings I felt almost normal. Then a smell or a song would pull me backward without warning. Healing, I realized, wasn't a straight line. It looped and doubled back. I stopped waiting for big breakthroughs. Progress showed up as small things. Answering the phone, walking past the church without tightening my jaw, laughing once, then feeling guilty, then letting the laughter stay. I began to understand that pain doesn't vanish. It becomes something you carry differently, not as a wound you keep reopening, but as a weight you learn how to balance. Some days it still tipped me over. Other days I barely noticed it was there. I rebuilt my life gently. I adjusted expectations, set quieter boundaries, and trusted myself in ways I hadn't before. There was no triumph in it, just steadiness. As life settled into this new shape, I felt ready to look back without flinching, not to reopen old hurts, but to name the lesson hidden inside them, and finally understand what this experience had been trying to teach me. It asked for patience, honesty, boundaries, courage, and self-respect, too. I keep returning to that moment in the church, standing alone while everyone else stayed seated. At the time, it felt like humiliation, something done to me. Now I see it as the point where I finally stopped abandoning myself. The lesson I didn't want to learn was simple and brutal. Love without boundaries is not loyalty. Silence is not peace. And protecting a story that isn't true eventually costs more than telling the truth ever will. For years, I believed endurance was virtue, that if I stayed quiet, flexible, agreeable, things would resolve on their own. What I learned instead is that integrity sometimes asks you to disappoint people you love. Choosing truth was not revenge. It was an act of self-respect. I had to accept that being a good mother does not mean accepting erasure. Being kind does not require being invisible. When I stepped away from what hurt me, I didn't become cold. I became clear. This experience reshaped how I see family. Love should feel safe, not conditional. Loyalty should not demand self-betrayal. And when something feels wrong deep in your body, ignoring it does not make it go away. If this story resonates with you, I invite you to sit with it gently. Have you ever stayed silent too long to keep the peace? I read every comment, and I'm grateful you listened. Sharing these moments reminds us we are not alone, and that courage often starts quietly. One honest decision at a time, even when understanding comes later after pain fades slowly. I began this story in a place of public shame, standing in a church aisle feeling smaller than I ever had. I'm ending it somewhere quieter, steadier, with a clearer sense of who I am and what I will no longer surrender. Pain did not ruin me. It refined me. It stripped away illusions I was clinging to and forced me to listen to my own voice when it mattered most. I didn't come out stronger in a dramatic way. I came out truer, and that has been enough. What stayed with me through all of this was love, not the kind that demands silence or sacrifice, but the kind that allows honesty, distance, and dignity to exist together. I learned that self-respect and compassion do not cancel each other out. They grow best side by side. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own life, I want you to know you're not weak for staying, and you're not cruel for leaving. We do the best we can with what we know at the time. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. If you feel comfortable, share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Have you ever had to choose truth over peace? I read every message, and I'm grateful you're here with me.